The sound of wind moves through the trees, thin and sharp, the kind that cuts through mountain air. Then a voice, controlled, almost too calm. My wife. She fell. It's the voice of Harold Henthorn, speaking to a 911 operator from deep inside Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. The signal fades in and out, his breathing steady, detached. He says his wife, Toni, slipped off a cliff during their anniversary hike. The operator asks questions. How far did she fall? Is she breathing? Can you reach her? And every answer feels a beat too late, a note too flat. Around them, the mountains stand in silence, the last light dying on the ridges. Rescuers begin climbing, flashlights cutting through mist, radios cracking through static. They expect panic. What they find instead is order. Harold is kneeling by his wife's body, still, phone in hand, saying he's been doing CPR. But the scene doesn't match the story. It's getting dark. There are no signs of a struggle, no loose soil where someone might have slipped. Toni's position seems deliberate, almost placed. The rescuers ask him what happened, and the story shifts. First she tripped, then she twisted her ankle, then she sat down and lost her balance. Every version folds into another, and yet Harold's tone never breaks. He keeps repeating that it was a horrible accident, as if rehearsing for someone who isn't there. When the first responders finally reach him, Harold's composure feels unnatural. He's polite, calm, even helpful. He tells them he's been there for hours, that he tried everything. But his phone records will later tell a different story. Long gaps, delayed calls, and text messages sent to family members while his wife was lying motionless on the mountainside. We're having a great day. One message said, perfect weather. It was sent after Toni was already dead. The rescuers move carefully, checking the cliff edge, the soil, the drop. It's a vertical fall, over 100 feet down. The wind carries the echo of their radios as they search for any trace of a slip, a slide, anything to explain what happened. But there's nothing, just a single, clean drop, and a husband who seems strangely prepared for it. As night falls, the park grows colder. The rescue team wraps up the scene, waiting for daylight to airlift her body. Harold sits in silence, staring into the darkness below. He doesn't cry. He doesn't move. And when a ranger tries to comfort him, he sighs softly, it's what God wanted. The next morning, word spreads fast. A tragic hiking accident. A devoted husband losing the love of his life. The kind of story that earns sympathy, that fills local papers with sorrow. But beneath that headline, in the quiet details of a broken timeline, something doesn't fit. Because if this was an accident, if it was truly a day of love gone wrong, we did Harold Henthorn know the exact path down the mountain before rescuers even arrived? Why had he already mapped out the way home? In the days to come, investigators will begin to pull at the loose threads of that story, and what they find will lead them far beyond the mountain, into the life of a man who spent years crafting the image of a perfect husband, while hiding something far darker beneath the surface. For now, all anyone knows is that a woman fell from a cliff. But this fall, it didn't start on the mountain. It started long before. Before the fall, before the headlines and the investigators, there was a picture that looked flawless. Harold and Toni Henthorn, the couple everyone in their Colorado church admired. He was attentive, soft-spoken, the kind of man who opened doors and quoted scripture. She was brilliant and kind, a successful ophthalmologist who spent her days helping patients see again and her nights helping friends believe in love. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of stability, faith, success, and devotion wrapped into one marriage. But perfect things are often rehearsed. From the beginning, Harold built their relationship like a performance, careful, controlled, and scripted down to the smallest detail. He had charm that felt intentional, a way of studying people's emotions and responding with exactly what they wanted to hear. When he met Toni through a church event in 1999, it will beat fast. Flowers, dinners, handwritten notes. Everything designed to sweep her into a story that looked like destiny. Friends said he seemed too good to be true. They were right. After they married, Harold began taking over everything. Their finances, schedules, even Toni's day-to-day decisions. He convinced her that it's better if one of us handles it all. He managed her bank accounts, opened her mail, and told friends it was to keep us stress-free. But soon, she wasn't allowed to write checks without asking. He said it was protection. She called it trust. Slowly, her independence faded under the weight of his control. At church, Harold was always smiling. He carried a Bible under his arm, volunteered for fundraisers, and quoted verses about loyalty and faith. To friends, he was the model husband, patient, spiritual, deeply in love. But behind closed doors, Toni's world was shrinking. She stopped visiting her parents as often, started missing gatherings with friends, and became harder to reach. When people asked, she said she was just busy. In truth, Harold didn't like her spending time away from home. He planned their lives meticulously. Every vacation, every outing, every dinner reservation was chosen by him. He told her it was his way of taking care of her, but the pattern was clear. Control disguised as care. Friends recall her once saying, quietly, "Sometimes I feel like I'm just a guest in my own life." There were warning signs, small, almost invisible moments that only made sense later, like how Harold would appear unannounced at her office to check on her, or how he discouraged her from talking about work problems, insisting other people won't understand us. He even convinced her to invest in joint insurance policies, just in case. The same phrase he'd used said before with his first wife. Still, Toni stayed. She believed in love, in marriage, in promises. She thought maybe Harold was just protective. Maybe she could make it work. When he surprised her with anniversary plans, she was touched. He said he had something special in mind. A quiet weekend in the mountains. Just the two of them. She packed her bag, excited for a chance to reconnect, to escape routine and breathe again. In the weeks leading up to that trip, Harold seemed unusually cheerful. He bought new hiking shoes, packed emergency supplies, and told friends he wanted to make it the best anniversary ever. He even scouted trails online, looking for the perfect view. He never told Toni which one he picked. The night before they left, she called her mom. She sounded tired but calm. "I'm happy we're doing this," she said. It's been a while since we had time alone. Her mother remembers something else too. A pause, then a sigh. "I just hope it brings us closer." The next morning, they drove toward Rocky Mountain National Park, sunlight cutting through the windshield. To anyone watching, it was a couple in love, celebrating another year together. But to our old, it was a plan long in motion. The story of the perfect marriage was almost over, and the mountain, quiet, endless, waiting, would be its final chapter. October 11th, 2012. The air in Rocky Mountain National Park was thin and sharp, the kind that makes every breath feel earned. Harold and Toni parked their blue SUV at the trailhead near Deer Mountain, a popular but challenging climb known for its steep edges and narrow paths. The morning light broke clean across the valley. The kind of day postcards are made of. Toni texted a friend before they started. "Harold planned a surprise hike for our anniversary. I don't even know where we're going yet, but it's supposed to be beautiful." That was her last message. The trail they took wasn't crowded, midweek, off-season, and quiet. Harold said he chose it for privacy, a romantic day away from everything. He carried a backpack full of supplies, snacks, binoculars, maps, and extra gear, more than any casual hiker would need. Toni trusted him. He'd told her he'd been up there before, that he knew the way. She followed, joking about how he always over-prepared. But Harold wasn't smiling much that morning. They climbed for hours, stopping occasionally to rest. Rangers later recalled that the weather had been unusually calm, no wind strong enough to knock anyone off balance, no slippery conditions. Around midday, Harold claimed Toni twisted her ankle, but he insisted they continued toward the summit. "We're almost there," he told her. "You'll love the view." She hesitated but kept walking, limping slightly on the uneven rock. The trail narrowed, and trees gave way to open cliffs overlooking the valley floor below. What happened next? Only Harold knows. At 5:55 p.m., a 911 call came from his phone. He sounded composed, explaining that his wife had fallen while taking a photo. He told the operator she'd dropped about 30 or 40 feet, a number that would later change, and that he couldn't reach her right away because of the steep terrain. The operator guided him through CPR instructions, but his answers were calm, almost robotic. "Yes, I'm doing compressions," he said evenly. "No, she's not responding." Rescuers began mobilizing, but reaching the site took time. The area Harold described was remote, several miles up from the nearest access point. By the time park rangers arrived, it was already dark. They found Harold sitting on the ground, phone still in hand, his wife's body lying motionless beside him. Her injuries were catastrophic, consistent with a high fall, but what puzzled investigators were the details. The dirt near the edge showed no skid marks, no signs of a slide or scramble, just a clean drop. Her hands had no defensive scratches, no evidence she'd tried to grab anything on the way down. Harold repeated his story to every ranger who asked. She slipped, she fell. It was an accident. But each version came out slightly different. In one, she was taking a picture. In another, she was resting. Then, he said she had reached out to steady herself and suddenly vanished. His calmness unsettled the rescuers. One of them later told police, "It didn't feel like a man who'd just lost his wife. It felt like a man explaining a report." As they tried to carry her body down the mountain, Harold offered to help but stayed distant, pacing and checking his phone. He told one ranger he'd been trying to reach emergency services for hours, but his call logs showed only one outgoing attempt, made much later than he claimed. The GPS data would later confirm something worse. Harold had been standing near the cliff edge for over 40 minutes before he made the call. 40 minutes, alone, unmoving. That night, at the ranger station, Harold seemed detached. He asked about when he could take her personal items, mentioned their insurance, and quietly thanked the officers. When investigators looked at his hands, they noticed his fingernails were clean, no dirt, no scratches, nothing to suggest a desperate attempt to save someone from a fall. He didn't have a single mark on him. The following morning, word spread quickly through the local community. Tragic accident, devoted husband, heartbreaking anniversary. Photos of the smiling couple filled local news sites. A man who'd lost everything in one instant, but the investigators who'd been on that mountain couldn't shake the unease. Why did he pick that trail? Why go to such a dangerous location with an injured wife? Why were there no skid marks, no trail of struggle, no urgency in his voice when he called for help? Later that week, while reviewing Harold's car, they found a folded piece of paper tucked inside the glove compartment. A detailed map of the very same trail. On it, several locations marked with small X's, each beside a steep drop-off. It was supposed to be a hike for love, but for Harold Henthorn, it had been a plan, mapped, measured, and executed. When investigators went through Harold's car, a few days after the fall, they expected to find grief flowers, personal items, maybe something sentimental. Instead, they found order, a manila envelope filled with printed trail maps, each carefully marked with red X's along the edges of Deer Mountain. At first, it looked like ordinary preparation, but when detectives overlaid the map on satellite images, they realized every X sat near a sheer drop, dangerous, unmarked cliffs where one wrong step could be fatal. The largest X was drawn right where Toni had fallen. To police, it felt like a blueprint. The symbols were deliberate, neatly drawn, and evenly spaced as if someone had scouted multiple options before choosing the final spot. The ink wasn't fresh. It had been on the paper for weeks. Harold told him he was just planning hiking routes, but when asked why he'd marked so many dangerous points, he said something odd. "I just wanted to find the best view." Investigators dug into his phone's GPS data, hoping to verify his version of events. What they found changed everything. In the hours before the 911 call, Harold's movements traced a tight pattern near the cliff, pacing, stopping, pacing again. He hadn't been wandering or lost. He was circling, waiting. When his wife's phone went silent, he stayed near the same coordinates for over 40 minutes before reaching out for help. The data painted a chilling image, not of panic, but of precision. Rangers remembered how unusually calm he was when they arrived, how he explained things as if reading from a script. He'd even asked me to rescue. If the helicopter would be available in time to preserve her organs. Later, he texted family and friends saying, "We had a great day until the accident." That message, time-stamped, was sent before rescue crews confirmed her death. The more they looked, the more details broke apart. Harold had told police the trail was Toni's idea, but friends said she didn't even know which hike he'd planned. They claimed AD never been there before, yet GPS data showed he'd visited the same area weeks earlier. Alone, the ranger remembered seeing a man matching his description parked nearby around that time, staring at a map inside his car. Then came the insurance records. Detectives discovered Harold had quietly increased Toni's life insurance just months before the trip, from $1.5 million to $4.5 million. Toni didn't even realize all the policies existed. Her signature had been scanned, not handwritten, on at least one of them. When questioned, Harold said, "It was just for security. She trusted me with all that." Investigators began to see a pattern. Control, preparation, patience. This wasn't the chaos of a tragic fall. It was a timeline designed by someone who knew exactly how events would unfold. The more they pieced together, the more the map in his car looked less like a hiking guide and more like evidence of intent. One detective later said, "It was the first time we stopped calling it an accident. The physical proof, the map, the GPS, the insurance, told a different story. One that stretched back far beyond this single trip, because when they checked the national park visitor logs, they found Harold had entered the park several times in the months leading up to the incident. Always alone, always near the same trail. They started to ask themselves the question that changes every case. Was this really his first time planning something like this? As investigators retraced his life, Aname surfaced another woman, another accident, another story buried in paperwork and sympathy. Before Toni, there had been someone else. Someone who also trusted Harold completely. Someone who also didn't come home. The perfect husband had lost 2 wives. And both had died alone, in remote places, with no witnesses. The mountain, it turned out, wasn't Harold Henthorn's first crime scene. It was just the one that finally exposed him. 17 years before Toni Henthorn's death, there was another tragedy, one that looked heartbreakingly similar. It was May 6th, 1995, and Harold's first wife, Lynn, was just 37. They'd been married 12 years, living in Colorado, known to their church as another perfect couple. Harold described Lynn as a gift from God, devoted and gentle. That day, he told police, they were driving on a backcountry road in Douglas County when their Jeep got a flat tire. They pulled to the side, miles from help. Harold said Lynn offered to help him fix it. Moments later, he claimed the jack slipped, and the car collapsed, crushing her underneath. When deputies arrived, the scene seemed tragic, but ordinary. The tire had been removed, the car angled on uneven ground. Harold sighed. Eddie tried lifting the vehicle, called for help, prayed over her body. He was emotional, consistent, believable. It was ruled an accident. No autopsy was ordered. Friends and family grieved, but a few felt something was off. One friend remembered Harold explaining the event with strange detail, like a man proud of how well he remembered his lines. In the weeks that followed, Harold received over $600,000 in life insurance payouts. He said he was devastated, that the money didn't matter. But he used it to buy a new home, a new car, and to fund small business ventures that never actually existed. Within a year, he was already seen on dating sites, looking for someone new. For years, the story stayed buried, a forgotten accident on a forgotten road. But when Toni's case opened in 2012, investigators started connecting threads. They dug through old records, tracked down retired officers, reopened boxes of yellowed reports. What they found stunned them. First, the tire. The so-called flat wasn't a flat at all. Photos showed no puncture, no tear. The jack had collapsed, but under a vehicle weight that didn't match the explanation. There were no skid marks, no sign of movement. Harold sighed had tried lifting the car, but there wasn't a single bruise or scrape on his hands. He said he'd called for help immediately, yet phone records showed a long gap between the accident and the first call. And just like with Toni, there were no witnesses. Then came the insurance pattern. Detectives realized Harold had taken out multiple overlapping policies on Lynn. The same tactic he would later use with Toni. Some of the forms were signed only days before Lynn's death. When questioned back then, Harold says he didn't like paperwork, so he handled it for her. FBI analysts reconstructed the financial timeline, and the parallels were chilling. Both wives insured for large amounts. Both deaths occurred in remote, isolated areas. Both times, Harold was the only witness. Both deaths resulted in major insurance payouts. Both women's families had voiced quiet concern about his behavior before the accidents. Forensic expert later described it simply. He was unlucky. He was patient. As more evidence surfaced, detectives realized how long Harold had been preparing for control. Not just in love, but in life itself. Lynn's death had given him confidence. He'd fooled investigators once. He learned what questions to expect, how to cry, when to sound broken. When he married Toni years later, it wasn't a new beginning. It was a sequel. One of Lynn's family members told reporters, "We always wondered how someone so kind could die like that. But we trusted the system. Now we know he counted on that trust." The FBI reconstructed Lynn's case with modern tools, 3D modeling, accident simulations, physics-based testing. Every version of Harold's story collapsed under the weight of evidence. The car's angle, the ground slope, the jack's pressure. None of it added up. It was impossible for that tire change to have gone wrong the way he described. When the truth became clear, even veteran investigators went silent. It wasn't just coincidence. It was repetition. A man who knew how to make murder look like misfortune. Harold Henthorn didn't lose to wives. He orchestrated 2 perfect tragedies, each one quieter, cleaner, and more convincing than the last. And now, with Toni gone and the map found, there was no doubt left. He hadn't just been hiking or fixing a tire. He'd been rehearsing. Once the FBI reopened the Henthorn file, the quiet suburban image of a grieving husband began to fracture piece by piece. What started as a simple fall from a cliff was now looking like a meticulously engineered homicide, and the man behind it had rehearsed every step. Investigators combed through every detail of Harold's life, his finances, his phone records, even his emails. What they found didn't fit the picture of a heartbroken spouse. Instead, it revealed a man living in layers of deceit. Harold wasn't working full-time, as he'd told everyone. In fact, the consulting business he bragged about didn't exist. His income came almost entirely from his wife's life insurance and inheritance money. They checked the couple's phones. On the day of the hike, Harold's story didn't match the data. He claimed they'd stopped for lunch, taken photos, and wandered off the trail before tragedy struck. But his GPS showed otherwise. His phone had been in the same coordinates for hours, hovering near the cliff where Toni fell like he'd been waiting for something. Even worse, text messages revealed Toni was growing uneasy. She'd told a close friend she felt smothered, that Harold had become overly controlling and secretive. One message read, "Greater than if something happens to me, promise me you'll make them look into Harold." When agents confronted Harold, he smiled. Calm, polite. The same mask he'd worn for decades. He spoke slowly, like a man in control. "It was a terrible accident," he repeated. "Toni loved hiking. She leaned over to take a picture, and she slipped. That's all." But the investigators had already spotted the pattern. They recreated the scene using drones and motion analysis. The ledge where Toni fell wasn't one people normally stopped at. It was narrow, hidden, and dangerous. Yet Harold had led her there deliberately. He said it was for a special anniversary photo. FBI agents measured the drop over 140 feet straight down. The impact point matched exactly where the map in his car had been marked. It was no coincidence. And then came the most chilling discovery: the insurance trail. Harold had taken out multiple life insurance policies on Toni totaling over $4.7 million, many of them without her full knowledge. He'd done it gradually, disguising the paperwork in stacks of mail. In some, he'd even forged her signature. One policy had been updated just months before the hike. When confronted with this, Harold didn't flinch. He told investigators it was just financial planning. But when they dug deeper, Téléphone More, a Google search on his computer from weeks before the incident, accidental death insurance payout mountain full. At this point, the FBI contacted park rangers, who recalled odd details from that day. Harold had insisted on hiking to a remote, unmarked area despite better, safer routes. After the fall, he was unusually calm, one ranger said. He wasn't shouting or crying like you'd expect. He was just calculating. The timeline only made things worse. Phone records showed a 45-minute delay between Toni's fall and Harold's emergency call. He claimed poor signal, yet investigators proved there was coverage in that area. During that gap, Harold had moved around the scene multiple times, as if rearranging details. Then, out of nowhere, came the biggest break. A hidden envelope found in Toni's office at home. Inside were printed copies of insurance documents, old texts, and notes labeled Harold, things that scare me. In one of them, Toni had written, "Greater than he watches me too closely. I can't make decisions without him correcting me. I'm scared of his kindness. It feels rehearsed." Those words became the emotional core of the case. She had sensed something coming, but didn't know how deep it went. Detectives began interviewing everyone who'd ever known Harold. Friends described him as controlling, calculating, and always playing the long game. One even recalled Harold bragging years ago, saying, "If you plan things right, bad luck can look like fate." The FBI built a psychological profile, narcissistic, emotionally detached, driven by the thrill of control. He didn't kill for rage. He killed for order to shape life and death on his own terms. By late 2014, the investigation had enough evidence to collapse the facade Harold had built for decades. 2 dead wives, 2 accidents, millions in insurance, and a trail of lies so clean it almost worked. But now, the truth was catching up, and for the first time, Harold Henthorn was no longer in control. The mask was cracking, and behind it was not a grieving husband, but a man who had turned love into a weapon. As the FBI tightened its grip around Harold Henthorn's story, they decided to go back, far back, to the beginning, before Toni. Before the mountain, before anyone suspected the smiling, church-going man with a soft voice could be capable of evil. That's when they found Lynn. Her name was Lynn Henthorn, Harold's first wife. She'd died nearly 2 decades earlier in 1995, under what everyone had believed was a tragic accident. The story went like this. Harold and Lynn were driving on a quiet, rural road south of Denver when their Jeep got a flat tire. They pulled over to the side of the road, and while changing it, the vehicle somehow slipped off the jack and crushed Lynn beneath it. Harold told police it had happened in an instant. He'd tried to save her, but it was too late. At the time, nobody questioned it. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no reason to doubt the clean-cut husband sobbing beside the wreck. The case was closed within days, labeled a freak mechanical accident. Harold collected her life insurance, held a heartfelt funeral, and moved on with his life. But now, in light of Toni's death, the story began to rot from the inside. Detectives reopened the old files, and what they found was hauntingly familiar. For one, the location. The Jeep Adentee, broken down on a busy road or near hell. It had happened in a secluded area, deep in the forest, miles away from the main highway. A place you wouldn't normally stop unless you were trying not to be seen. And the flat tire. Experts later examined photos and determined it looked deliberately slashed, not naturally worn. Then came the witness accounts. A passerby had recalled seeing Harold waving for help, but not in panic. More like someone signaling calmly for assistance. When they arrived, Lynn was already gone. Her body was pinned perfectly under the Jeep in a way that seemed convenient. One investigator said it was like the car was placed over her, not dropped. And once again, the money trail followed. Lynn had multiple life insurance policies, more than one person should ever need. Harold had taken out at least 3, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, and had filed claims almost immediately after her death. When police asked him back then why there were so many, he gave the same line he'd use years later. Just financial security. But the most chilling discovery came from the couple's friend group. One woman, still shaken after all those years, told investigators that Lynn had confided in her weeks before the accident. She'd said Harold had become controlling, making her account for every minute, every dollar. And then she said something that echoed through time. If something ever happens to me, make sure they look into Harold. It was the exact same warning Toni gave before her death. 2 wives, years apart, both sensing something they couldn't quite name. Both voicing the same fear, both dying in accidents that made Harold a wealthy widower. The FBI built a timeline connecting both deaths. They discovered that after Lynn's funeral, Harold had used her insurance payout to buy a large home, a new car, and start his so-called consulting business. Within months, he was attending church again. Charming, sociable, even volunteering. Friends remembered how quickly he seemed to recover. Then, almost like clockwork, he met Toni, a successful, kind-hearted ophthalmologist with a generous soul. The perfect next target. She was stable, trusting, financially secure. To Harold, she wasn't a partner. She was a plan. Investigators realized that Toni's death wasn't spontaneous. It was patterned an upgraded version of the same crime he'd gotten away with once before. This time, he'd removed any traceable mechanical element, choosing a natural landscape instead. Gravity would be his weapon. No car, no tools, no witnesses. Just an accident on a mountain. But this time, he'd miscalculated. Because while the first wife's story had vanished quietly into the past, Toni's family refused to let hers die the same way. They pushed, demanded answers, and never stopped asking questions. And now, the 2 stories, one buried, one exposed, were converging. The same man, the same method, the same motive. Only now, the FBI had something they didn't have 20 years ago. Proof. And soon, they'd have something even stronger. Witnesses who would help destroy Harold S. Perfect Facade in court. The man who lived decades, believing he could outsmart death, was about to meet justice, slow, deliberate, and unescapable. By the time Harold Henthorn stood in court, the mask of a loving husband had completely shattered. What faced the world now wasn't he? A grieving man. It was a manipulator who had spent decades perfecting the art of murder, disguised as tragedy. The courtroom in Denver was packed, silent, except for the echo of cameras clicking as Harold walked in wearing a crisp suit and a faint, emotionless smile. It looked calm, even confident, as if he still believed he could talk his way out of it, like he always had. But this time, the evidence was louder than his charm. Prosecutors began by projecting a single image on the courtroom screen. The map, the one found in Harold's car, covered in red X's. Then they layered it with GPS data, showing his movements circling the exact cliff where Toni had fallen. The jurors stared in disbelief. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. The lead prosecutor described it best. Greater than this wasn't an accident. This was a man rehearsing death until it looked natural. Then came the insurance files, policy after policy, all with Harold's signature, all with forged ones of Toni's. Every signature, a quiet betrayal. He had set her worth not as a wife, but as a payout. When Toni's friends testified, some couldn't even finish their sentences. One broke down as she recalled Toni's last text. "Greater than I'm scared. Something doesn't feel right about this trip." The FBI agents laid out the timeline, the 45-minute delay in the 911 call, the staged scene, the calm tone of his voice as he described his wife's accident. They played the actual call in court. The jury heard it. No panic, no fear, just calculated precision. One juror later said it sounded like he was ordering a pizza. Then came the twist that sealed his fate, the re-examination of Lynn Henthorn's death. His first wife. Photos of the crushed Jeep were shown side by side with evidence of a deliberately tampered jack. Experts explained how the pattern of damage didn't match a random collapse. The jury saw how similar both deaths were: isolated locations, no witnesses, heavy insurance coverage, and Harold is the only survivor both times. A friend of Lynn testified about their last conversation before she died. Her words hit like a thunderclap. "Greater than she told me she didn't feel safe with Harold anymore. She said he was planning something." And for the first time, Harold's composure cracked. Estaré don, his hands gripping the defense table. But he never spoke. Not once during the entire trial did Harold testify. He just sat there, Expressionless, a man stripped of his lies but clinging to silence like a final shield. When the prosecution rested, they displayed one final image, Toni's wedding photo. Smiling, unaware of what waited years ahead. Then they played the closing argument. He didn't lose 2 wives. He murdered 2 women who trusted him completely. He planned their deaths like business deals and thought he was smarter than everyone else. But this time, the mountain spoke. After only 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder. Toni's family cried quietly as Harold sat motionless, his jaw locked, eyes cold. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole, calling his actions the ultimate betrayal of trust. Even after the trial, Harold refused to admit guilt. He maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a government conspiracy and media distortion. File. Appeal after appeal. Everyone rejected. Today, Harold Henthorn sits in a maximum security federal prison in Colorado, surrounded by the silence he once controlled. No more cameras, no more sympathy, no more wives to manipulate. Just a man who once believed he could choreograph death, now trapped in the one place he can control. For years, people have called him the perfect husband. But the truth is far darker. He was a man who weaponized love, patience, and trust, and turned them into the tools of murder. And as the years pass, one thing remains clear. Toni and Lynn's voices, silenced in life, became the very proof that brought him down. Justice didn't just catch Harold Henthorn, it learned how to read his kind. In the years since Harold Henthorn's conviction, his story has become a grim case study, not just of murder, but of control. Psychologists, detectives, even criminology students have dissected it, trying to understand how a man could so calmly orchestrate the deaths of 2 women who trusted him completely. They say Harold's power wasn't in violence. It was in patience. He planned, waited, and built a mask so perfect that even his victims couldn't see behind it. To his neighbors, he was a doting husband. To his church, a kind man of faith. But beneath that charm lived a mind that calculated affection like math, always measuring, always waiting for the right moment to cash it all in. After his arrest, investigators uncovered even more chilling traces of his psychology. In a notebook seized from his office, Harold had written lists, not of tasks or finances, but of people under each name. There were notes. Greater than, trusts easily, high income, emotionally loyal. They weren't just names, they were potential targets, and that's what makes the Henthorn case so haunting. It wasn't about rage or impulse. It was about precision. He didn't just take lives, he built narratives, staged grief, and used love as the perfect cover. For 20 years, he walked freely, attending weddings, church services, dinners, all while hiding the fact that both his wives had died by his design. Even now, behind bars, Harold still insists he's innocent. He writes letters proclaiming he was framed, and that Toni's death was God's test. But the mountain, the maps, the data, they all speak louder than his words ever could. Toni's brother once said in an interview he thought he could choreograph her death like a movie scene. But the truth always finds its way out, even mountains. Remember, the Henthorn case reminds us of something uncomfortable. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it prays with you. Sometimes it waits for years, convincing everyone that what happened was fate. But fate doesn't buy insurance policies. Fate doesn't scout cliffs. And fate doesn't rehearse death. It was never an accident. It was a plan, one that took 2 lives, but eventually exposed itself piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for Harold to hide. And as for Toni and Lynn, their names live far beyond the cold paperwork of the courtroom. They became the proof that love can be betrayed, but truth, even when buried, finds a way to climb back into the light. If you found this story, chillin'. There are more untold cases just like this one, real stories of people who thought they could hide their secrets forever. Subscribe to Morterra, where every week we uncover the crimes they never wanted you to know. Because in the end, the truth always surfaces.